The wedding hall in Addis Ababa was full of white light. Soft music floated in the air. Flowers lined the aisle. Everyone was smiling, or at least pretending to. I stood there as the bride, Leah Bekele, my hands slightly shaking inside my white dress. Beside me sat my mother, Saba Bekele, calm and quiet, wearing a simple cream shawl she had stitched herself. Then it happened. My groom's aunt leaned toward another woman and laughed loudly. Not a soft laugh, not a polite one. A sharp, careless laugh that cut through the room. She looked straight at my mother and said, "Some people really don't know how to dress for weddings. It's like a mistake in white light." Her words landed like a slap. The laughter died instantly. The music kept playing, but it sounded far away. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Plates froze halfway to mouths. The entire hall went still, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe. I looked at my mother. She didn't say a word. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She slowly lowered her eyes to her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Her lips curved into a small, polite smile, the kind she always wore when she didn't want to make trouble. I knew that smile. I had grown up with it. It was the smile she wore when life was unfair and she chose dignity instead of noise. My chest tightened. I waited for someone to say something. Anyone. But no one did. The white light that once felt beautiful now felt harsh. Exposing. Heavy. In that moment, standing in my wedding dress, I realized something painful. The insult wasn't loud because of her voice. It was loud because of the silence that followed. The hall was quiet for a long moment after the insult. I held my breath, expecting anyone to speak up. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling inside the folds of my dress. Surely my father-in-law would say something. Surely the other guests would at least look embarrassed. But nothing. Not a word. Not even a flicker of discomfort on their faces. The silence was heavier than any insult. The music kept playing, a soft, cheerful melody that now felt cruel. People clapped politely after the next song, but it didn't reach my ears. All I could hear was the echo of those words, sharp and unkind, bouncing around the room. A mistake in white light. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the fact that everyone acted like it was nothing, like they didn't even hear them. I looked at my mother, Saba Bekele. She was sitting there, calm as ever, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her smile never left her face, not really. It was small, quiet, almost fragile, but it carried something stronger than anger or fear. Pride. Dignity. I saw her eyes glimmer with the same quiet strength I had always known in her. She was not shaking. She was not lashing out. She was choosing herself, choosing her peace, in a room full of people who had decided to ignore her. It hurt more than the words themselves, watching her stay so calm when I wanted to explode. I wanted to yell, to defend her, to tell the world that she was everything those people were not. But I froze. I realized then that this wasn't a joke. No one thought it was funny. The laughter had been cruel, meant to humiliate, and the silence afterward made it worse. My mother had been insulted in front of everyone she barely knew, and no one cared enough to stand by her side. I had always known my mother was strong. I had always admired her for that. But that day I understood something deeper. Strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is the ability to hold your head high, to smile softly, to carry yourself with dignity even when the world chooses to humiliate you. That smile, calm and unbroken, was louder than anything the aunt had said. It demanded attention without demanding anyone's approval. I felt a mix of anger, shame, and awe swirl inside me. Anger at the aunt for being cruel, shame at myself for not knowing how to stop it, awe at my mother for showing a kind of power I had never fully understood before. I realized in that moment that no words, no insults, no laughter could ever break her. And maybe, just maybe, that silence, the silence that hurt more than any shout, was the lesson she wanted me to see. From then on, I looked at her differently, not as just my mother but as a force. The world could laugh, the world could whisper, the world could try to tear people down, but the quiet dignity she carried reminded me that some strength is deeper than noise. And that strength was mine to carry forward too. I remember sitting on the worn wooden stool in my mother's small tailoring shop when I was a little girl. The smell of fabric and thread was everywhere, mixed with the faint scent of tea she always kept near her sewing machine. She would hum quietly as she worked, her fingers moving fast and steady, turning scraps of cloth into beautiful dresses, suits, and sometimes little uniforms for children at the local school. My mother, Saba Bekele, was a single mother long before I understood what that really meant. She worked every day from sunrise to late at night, often skipping meals so I could eat. I watched her count money carefully, set aside tiny amounts for savings, and still managed to buy me school books I didn't know she could barely afford. She never complained about the long hours or the exhaustion that made her shoulders ache. She carried it all quietly, as if complaining was a luxury we couldn't afford. People in the neighborhood sometimes whispered about her, about how she struggled, about how raising me alone must be hard. But I never heard her respond with anger or excuses. She simply smiled and kept working. I didn't understand then, but now I do. She wasn't trying to prove anything to the world. She wasn't looking for sympathy or applause. She was teaching me something far more important: dignity. I remember the nights she stayed up late to finish a dress for a wedding, stitching by the dim light of a single bulb. Her hands were raw and sore, but she never let it show. She would tell me, "People will always judge, Leah. But how you carry yourself, that is yours. That is what matters." I didn't always understand what she meant, but I carried those words with me, even when I got older. Even when the world tried to humiliate me, even when I felt small or unworthy, I remembered her example. It wasn't about loud arguments or dramatic gestures. It was about showing strength without needing to shout, about walking through the world with your head held high, even if people tried to push you down. I remember the way she treated her customers with respect, even when they were rude, even when they tried to cheat her. She had this quiet authority, a calm presence that made people realize she was not someone to underestimate. Looking back now, I understand why she handled my wedding day the way she did. When my in-law aunt insulted her in front of everyone, she didn't shout back or create a scene. She stayed calm, her smile small but unwavering. That was my mother's way. She had spent a lifetime teaching me, and everyone around her, that dignity was more powerful than noise. That silence, when carried with strength, could speak louder than any insult. All those years in that little shop, all those sleepless nights and sacrifices, had shaped her into a woman who could face the world without fear, without anger, without drama. And that day, standing in the middle of my wedding, I finally understood. The world didn't know her story. They never knew the battle she had fought, the sacrifices she had made, the strength she carried quietly every single day. But I knew. I had seen it. And that knowledge made me see her as the strongest person I would ever know. The reception in Nairobi was buzzing with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Guests danced under strings of warm lights, their smiles bright, their chatter filling the air. I was trying to soak it all in, trying to feel like everything was perfect. But my mind was still tangled in what had happened earlier, back in Addis Ababa. My mother had handled it with such quiet power, and I couldn't stop thinking about how sharp the silence had been. I stepped out of the crowd, letting the music fade behind me. The cool night air hit my face as I walked toward the terrace. I needed a moment to breathe, to collect myself. My hands were still trembling slightly, the adrenaline from the wedding chaos coursing through me. Then my phone buzzed. I frowned, not expecting anyone to call me at this exact moment. I answered a little cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. It was one of the lawyers from my mother's holding company. "Ms. Bekele," he said, "we've finalized the documents. The contracts are ready, the shares have been transferred. The board meeting vote can be executed immediately if you confirm." I froze for a second, the words sinking in. All this time, my mother had been orchestrating quietly, building a fortress right under their noses. The insults, the laughter, the arrogance of my in-laws. It hadn't mattered. She had already ensured that control, respect, and power were secured where it counted. I stepped further away from the noise of the reception, holding the phone close, letting the night swallow my thoughts. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that everything was in motion. Everything she had prepared, every careful step she had taken, was now reaching its turning point. I glanced at the sparkling lights of Nairobi, the city alive beneath me, and whispered softly, almost to myself, "Proceed." The lawyer responded with a quiet acknowledgement, then hung up. My fingers lingered on the phone for a moment, thinking of my mother, her calm, unshakable presence. I could almost hear her voice in my head, steady and clear. Strength isn't always loud. Timing is everything. Watch and act when the moment comes. I took a deep breath and looked back at the reception hall. Inside, everyone was still dancing, still laughing, oblivious to the quiet storm that had been set in motion. My mother's smile, the one she wore so effortlessly in Addis Ababa, flashed in my memory. It wasn't just a smile, it was a signal. Power could be gentle, invisible, and still unstoppable. I slipped my phone into my clutch, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. The music, the dancing, the cheers, they were background noise to what had really happened. The game had shifted, and I knew that by the time anyone realized it, it would be too late. My mother's plan, executed with patience and precision, was already working, and I was proud more than I had ever been in my life to be standing next to her, learning how quiet strength could change everything. For weeks, everyone kept talking about the wedding venue, how grand it was, how expensive, how lucky we were to celebrate in such a beautiful place. My in-laws spoke about it the loudest, as if the venue itself proved their status. They walked around proudly, greeting guests like they owned the world. No one asked questions. No one checked details. They didn't need to, or so they thought. What they never knew was that this place had a story of its own. Years ago, when this hall was just an idea on paper, my mother had been there quietly. No cameras, no applause, just documents, signatures, and patience. She didn't put her name on banners or plaques. She invested through a holding company, one of several small partners at the time. She stayed silent while others took credit. That was always her way. Build quietly, speak only when necessary. The same people who laughed at her clothes, who judged her calm voice and simple ways, had no idea where they were standing. They mocked what they never checked. They assumed silence meant small. They assumed dignity meant weakness. They assumed too much. I watched them that night, laughing freely, sipping drinks, making careless comments about who belongs and who doesn't. Every word felt heavier now because I knew the truth. The venue they were so proud of was already secured. The paperwork had been signed weeks ago. The ownership structure had shifted. Control had been decided in rooms they were never invited into. My mother sat calmly near the front, the same gentle smile on her face. She didn't look around for approval. She didn't wait for recognition. She didn't need to. Everything was already in place. Every document had been reviewed. Every signature was final. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was emotional. It was business, handled with care and precision. I thought about the aunt who had laughed at her, the way her voice echoed through the hall earlier that day. I wondered what she would feel if she knew the truth, if she knew that the woman she dismissed as simple had more control over this space than anyone else in the room. But my mother didn't want revenge. She never did. She believed in lessons, not humiliation. That's what made it powerful. The venue stood there, glowing under soft lights, holding secrets in its walls. It had watched people judge, laugh, and underestimate. It had watched my mother walk in quietly, sit down gracefully, and say nothing. And soon it would watch the truth rise without anger, without shouting, without drama. Some people make noise to feel powerful. Others build power so quietly that by the time it's revealed, there's nothing left to argue about. That night, I understood which one my mother was. The music was loud and cheerful, filling the hall with laughter and movement. People were dancing, clapping, and taking photos, completely lost in the celebration. For a moment, it almost felt like everything was normal again, like nothing uncomfortable had ever happened, like the insult, the silence, and the tension were all just a bad dream. Then the music stopped, not slowly, not gently. It cut off all at once, sharp and sudden, like someone had pulled a plug from the wall. Conversations crashed into each other. Dancers froze mid-step. Heads turned toward the stage in confusion. A few people laughed nervously, thinking it was a mistake. That's when I saw the venue manager walk in. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. His face was tight serious. He scanned the room once, then walked straight toward my groom's father. He leaned down and spoke in a low voice, careful but firm. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the reaction. The color drained from my father-in-law's face. His confident posture collapsed. His eyes widened, then darted around the room like he was searching for an exit. The whispers continued. Short. Urgent. Each sentence seemed to press heavier than the last. My father-in-law's jaw tightened. His hand shook slightly as he nodded. Panic replaced pride in seconds. He tried to laugh it off at first, waving his hand like it was nothing. But the manager didn't laugh back. He simply waited. Around them, guests started to notice. The air shifted. Smiles faded. People leaned toward each other, whispering questions. What happened? Why did the music stop? Is everything okay? No one had answers. I looked across the room. My mother was still seated. Saba Bekele hadn't moved an inch. Her back was straight. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. She looked exactly the same as she had before the music stopped. Peaceful. Grounded. Almost untouched by the chaos spreading through the room. It was as if she had been expecting this moment all along. That contrast hit me hard. Everyone else was confused, anxious, restless. But my mother sat there like the storm was passing over her, not through her. She didn't look at my father-in-law. She didn't look at the manager. She didn't look at the guests. She simply waited. The music never came back on. The silence grew heavier with every second. The joy that once filled the hall drained away, replaced by tension and uncertainty. My father-in-law wiped his forehead with a napkin. The aunt who had laughed earlier sat stiff in her chair, her mouth tight, her eyes fixed on the floor. I realized then that this wasn't chaos. This was timing. The kind of timing my mother had always believed in. Quiet. Precise. Unavoidable. While the room buzzed with confusion and fear, she remained calm, carrying the same dignity she had carried her whole life. And in that moment I understood something clearly. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply enters the room, stops the music, and lets silence do the rest. The silence didn't last long. It never does when people start to realize they may have made a serious mistake. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Nervous laughter tried to fill the empty space where music used to be. My groom's relatives began whispering again, this time with forced smiles and uneasy glances. We need to talk now, my father-in-law said suddenly, his voice too loud, too rushed. He tried to sound calm, but it didn't work. The confidence he had worn all evening was gone. The aunt, the same one who had laughed earlier, let out a weak chuckle. It's all just a misunderstanding, she said quickly, waving her hand as if she could brush the moment away. You know how jokes get twisted in big gatherings. Joke. The word hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. They started talking all at once, explaining, apologizing without really apologizing. No offense was meant. You must have taken it the wrong way. We were just celebrating. Their voices overlapped, desperate to rewrite what had already happened. They smiled too much, laughed too loudly, hoping the past hour could be erased if they pretended hard enough. I felt my hands curl into fists. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them that insults don't disappear just because someone regrets saying them. But before I could move, my mother did something she hadn't done all night. She stood up. The room went quiet again instantly. No announcement, no raised voice. Just the simple sound of her chair moving back. Saba Bekele rose slowly, calmly, like she had all the time in the world. Her presence alone shifted the air. People straightened. Conversations stopped. Even those who had tried to laugh it off suddenly looked unsure. She didn't look angry. That's what surprised everyone the most. Her face was composed, her expression soft but firm. She adjusted her shawl gently, the same one she had worn when she was insulted, and looked at my in-laws with steady eyes. Not accusing, not pleading, just clear. You don't need to explain, she said quietly. Those 5 words carried more weight than all their rushed excuses. She wasn't interested in their nervous laughter or their half apologies. She wasn't there to argue or embarrass anyone. She had already endured worse in life and survived with dignity. This moment didn't shake her. It revealed them. My father-in-law opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. The aunt avoided eye contact, suddenly very interested in the floor. The truth was standing right in front of them now, and there was no joke left to hide behind. Watching my mother stand there, calm and unbreakable, something settled inside me. I realized that respect isn't demanded. It's established. And once it is, no amount of nervous laughter can undo it. In that moment they understood. Too late but clearly. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a lesson. My mother didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When she finally spoke, it was soft, steady, and clear enough that every word landed exactly where it needed to. The room leaned in without realizing it. Even the ones who had been whispering fell silent. "There's something I should clarify," she said calmly. She didn't look at anyone with anger. There was no bitterness in her tone, no need to defend herself. She simply spoke the truth, the kind that doesn't shout because it doesn't need permission to exist. She explained slowly and carefully that the wedding venue was not just a place we had rented for one night. She spoke about the holding company, about how investments work, about being a silent partner. She didn't list numbers or brag about influence. She didn't name titles. She only shared what was necessary. Simple. Unavoidable. As she spoke, I watched faces change. Confident smiles faded. Proud shoulders stiffened. People who had laughed earlier now sat very still. The aunt who had made the comment looked like she wanted the floor to open beneath her chair. No one interrupted. No one dared to. Then my mother spoke about respect. Not as a lecture. Not as a warning. But as something she had lived by her whole life. "Respect is not about how loudly someone speaks," she said gently. "It's about how carefully they treat others, especially when they think no one is watching." There was no insult in her words. Not a single one. She didn't throw the earlier humiliation back at them. She didn't remind anyone of what had been said about her clothes or her presence. She let the truth do all the work. The silence in the room grew deeper with every second. I could hear someone swallow hard. I could hear a chair creak. Even the air felt heavier. This wasn't an uncomfortable silence filled with confusion. This was the kind of silence that comes when people finally understand what they've done. My mother finished speaking and gently folded her hands in front of her again. No dramatic pause. No demand for an apology. She simply sat down. That was the moment that stayed with me. Power had just been shown, not through anger or humiliation, but through calm honesty. She had explained ownership without pride and respect without punishment. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need validation. She had dignity, and that was enough. No one clapped. No one spoke. The room remained silent, because there was nothing left to argue about. The truth had been spoken without anger, and it stood there quietly, unshaken. The apologies came quickly after that. Too quickly. My father-in-law cleared his throat and stood up, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The aunt followed, her voice suddenly soft, careful, almost fragile. Words like sorry, misunderstanding, and respect filled the air, stacked on top of each other as if saying them enough times could undo what had already been done. They apologized in front of everyone. People nodded. Some looked relieved, like the tension had finally been resolved. But I felt nothing settle inside me. No peace. No comfort. Just clarity. It was too late. Not because the apology wasn't spoken, but because it was only spoken after power had been revealed, after ownership was explained, after control shifted. If none of that had happened, I knew the truth. The silence would have continued. The laughter would have been excused. My mother would have been expected to swallow the insult and move on quietly, like she always had. I looked at my mother as they spoke. She listened politely, the same calm expression on her face. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She didn't smile wider. She didn't soften. She simply accepted the words and let them pass through her. She wasn't waiting for apologies anymore. She had already moved beyond needing them. That's when I understood something important about power. Power doesn't always look like shouting or winning an argument. Sometimes it looks like knowing exactly where to draw the line and refusing to let anyone cross it again. It looks like calm eyes and a straight back. It looks like not chasing validation from people who only offer respect when it benefits them. Standing there in my wedding dress, I saw my future clearly for the first time. This wasn't about revenge. I didn't want to humiliate them. I didn't want to shout or prove anything. I wanted boundaries. Strong ones, quiet ones. The kind that don't need explaining again and again. The kind that protect peace instead of feeding pride. I realized I could love my husband and still protect my mother. Could be polite. The wedding ended, but the lesson stayed with me. In Cape Coast, Ghana, the ocean moved gently beside us, waves rising and falling like nothing in the world had changed. To everyone else, it looked like a beautiful ending to a dramatic day. The marriage continued. The smiles returned. Photos were taken. Life moved on. But control had already shifted. Something quiet had changed beneath the surface. The laughter sounded different now. Softer. Careful. People chose their words more slowly. They had learned that not everything powerful announces itself loudly. Some things wait. Some things watch. My husband and I stood side by side, and I knew our marriage would go on, but not the way it might have before. Boundaries had been drawn without shouting. Respect had been earned without begging. My mother didn't need to demand her place. She had always owned it. I watched her walk near the shoreline, her steps calm, her posture steady. The same woman who once sat silently through an insult now carried herself with even more grace. Not because she had been proven right, but because she had always been strong. The world had just finally caught up. That day taught me something no speech ever could. Love does not mean allowing disrespect. Family does not mean silence. And power does not always look like control over people. Sometimes it looks like control over yourself. The people who had laughed learned a quiet lesson. Their jokes didn't land anymore. Their confidence no longer filled the room. They understood now that dignity cannot be mocked without consequences. As the sun lowered over the water, I felt calm in a way I never had before. I knew the future would not be loud. It would be clear. They dressed their cruelty as humor. My mother wore silence like armor. And when the truth stood up, their laughter had nowhere to hide.